My stepson stood up at family dinner and announced he'd hired a lawyer to investigate irregularities in his father's finances since I married him. Then looked me dead in the eye and said everyone always knew I'd married his father for the money. He had no idea I'd spent 25 years at the FBI finding people exactly like him. Trevor set his wine glass down with a little more force than necessary and folded his hands on the table like a man about to deliver a verdict he'd been rehearsing for weeks. "I think it's time we're all honest with each other," he said, looking around at the six of us gathered for what was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday dinner. "Dad's health isn't what it used to be. And frankly, ever since Diane married into this family, there have been some pretty concerning patterns in his accounts." I set down my own fork and looked at him. Trevor Ashford, 38 years old, his father's only son, the kind of man who had never once, in the 8 years I'd been married to his father, asked me a single genuine question about my own life, before I became, in his mind, simply the woman who married Richard. "Concerning patterns," I repeated. "We've retained an elder law attorney," Melissa added, Trevor's older sister, her voice carrying that particular brand of cool satisfaction people get when they believe they've finally caught someone, "to review everything. And honestly, Diane, we've always known why you married Dad. We just didn't expect you to be quite this obvious about it." I looked across the table at Richard, my husband of 8 years, 71 years old, his hands trembling slightly around his own fork, a small tremor that had grown more pronounced over the past year. He looked confused, caught somewhere between his children and his wife, uncertain which direction loyalty was supposed to point. "Dad," Trevor said, sliding a folder across the tablecloth toward his father, "we just need your signature here. Power of attorney, transferred to me, just as a precaution, given everything that's been happening." I looked at that folder. A financial power of attorney form, Trevor's name already typed at the bottom of the delegation section. A yellow arrow sticker pointing helpfully at the signature line. The kind of sticker attorneys use when they expect a signature to happen quickly, without too many questions. "What exactly do you believe has been happening, Trevor?" I asked calmly. "Withdrawals," he said. "Transfers, things that don't add up, going back at least 2 years. And you've reviewed the actual bank statements yourself?" I asked. "Personally? Line by line?" He hesitated, just slightly. "I've seen enough to be concerned." I looked at Melissa. "Have you?" "We don't need to justify our concerns to you, Diane," she said. "We just need Dad to sign." I looked at my husband, watching his hand hover uncertainly over that pen. "Richard," I said gently, "you don't have to sign anything at this table tonight." Trevor's jaw tightened. "This isn't your decision to make, Diane." I picked up that pen before Richard could reach it. Trevor's expression shifted, satisfied, the way a man's face changes when he believes the hardest part of a plan is already behind him. I set the pen back down, exactly where it had been, without a single mark on the page. "I think before anyone signs anything," I said quietly, "we should all take a much closer look at those bank statements you're so concerned about." Together, line by line. The table went silent. Trevor's confident expression flickered. Just for a moment, the way a person's face does when a plan they've rehearsed carefully in their head doesn't land the way they expected out loud. "You have no idea what you're about to find," I told him. He had absolutely no idea, sitting across that dinner table, how right I actually was. 6 weeks earlier. My name is Diane Foster Ashford. I spent 25 years as a forensic accountant with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, most of that time embedded within the Financial Crimes Division, tracing embezzlement schemes, shell corporations, and fraud networks across 3 different field offices before retiring at 53, with more citations and closed cases than I've ever felt the need to mention at dinner parties. I was widowed at 48, my first husband Paul dying suddenly of a heart attack after 20 years of a marriage built on early mornings, late nights, and a shared understanding of exactly how demanding federal law enforcement careers could be. I never expected to remarry. For nearly 5 years, I built a quiet, satisfying life alone, consulting occasionally on complex fraud cases after my official retirement, tending a garden Paul and I had never had time to properly plant. I met Richard Ashford at a charity gala benefiting a local children's hospital 7 years after Paul's death. Richard had lost his own wife, Eleanor, to breast cancer 2 years earlier, and there was something immediately familiar in the particular quality of his loneliness. A man still learning how to be single again after decades of being half of something else. We talked for nearly 3 hours that first evening, mostly about nothing important, and somewhere in that conversation, I remember thinking, for the first time in years, that I might not have to spend the rest of my life entirely alone. We married 18 months later, quietly, at a small ceremony with only a handful of close friends. Richard had built a successful architecture firm over 4 decades. Comfortable but not extraordinarily wealthy. Certainly nothing that would have made marrying him, for the money, as Melissa liked to imply, a particularly efficient life strategy for anyone actually running the numbers. His children, Trevor and Melissa, both adults with their own households by the time Richard and I met, never fully warmed to me. I understood some of that instinctively. I was not their mother, arriving into their father's life after a loss they were still quietly grieving themselves. I tried, for years, to give that grief space and patience. But slowly, the comments started. Dad's always been generous, sometimes too generous, if you know what I mean. It's interesting, the timing of you two meeting so soon after Mom passed. We just want to make sure Dad's protected, financially, now that he's getting older. Small pebbles, never quite a boulder, not directly. I told myself, the way people in blended families often do, that trust simply takes longer to build in some directions than others. About a year before that Sunday dinner, Richard began showing early symptoms of Parkinson's disease, a slight tremor in his right hand, occasional stiffness, moments of confusion that were mild but noticeable to those of us paying close attention. His neurologist assured us his cognitive function remained largely intact, though his physical symptoms would likely progress gradually over time. Trevor and Melissa, understandably, grew more concerned. What concerned me was the particular direction their concerns seemed to be pointing, less toward their father's well-being directly, and more, increasingly, toward his finances and my role in managing them. About 5 weeks before that dinner, Trevor stopped by while I was working in the garden. "Diane, can I ask you something? Has Dad given you access to all of his accounts, investment portfolios, retirement funds, all of it?" "We've always managed our finances jointly, Trevor. That's fairly standard for a marriage." "I'm just saying," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It might be worth Dad consulting someone independent about his financial planning, someone outside the family. I am, technically, quite independently qualified to review financial records myself," I said, "but I appreciate the concern." He laughed, a little too quickly. "No offense, Diane, but reading a checkbook isn't exactly the same as real financial expertise." I should have felt something sharper in that moment. Instead, I simply returned to my roses and let the comment pass, the way I'd let similar comments pass for years. A week later, Richard's longtime accountant, a careful, precise man named Gerald Whitfield, who had managed the architecture firm's books for nearly 3 decades, called me directly. "Diane, I probably shouldn't be calling you about this without Richard present, but I noticed something in this quarter's personal account reconciliation that concerns me." "Go on, Gerald." "There's a pattern of transfers, small at first, growing larger over roughly the last 2 years, moving from Richard's personal investment accounts into an LC I don't recognize. Ashford Capital Holdings. I assumed it might be something you and Richard had set up together, some kind of estate planning vehicle. But the paperwork trail is oddly thin for something that formal." My stomach tightened slightly. "Who has signing authority on that LLC, Gerald?" There was a pause. "Trevor," he finally said. "Trevor is listed as the sole managing member." I thanked Gerald carefully, told him I'd look into it directly, and sat with that information for several days before mentioning it to anyone, including Richard, wanting to understand the full shape of what I was looking at before raising an alarm that might not yet be fully justified. Around that same time, a compliance letter arrived from our joint bank, flagging unusual withdrawal activity across several of Richard's accounts over recent months. I set it on the kitchen counter, intending to review it carefully once I'd finished cross-referencing Gerald's information, and let it sit there, unopened for several days longer than it should have. That, I can tell you now, was very nearly a costly delay. When something as specific as an unusual activity flag arrives from a financial institution, open it immediately and take it seriously the same day. When I finally sat down and began reviewing Richard's account statements methodically, the training from 25 years at the Bureau settled over me like an old familiar coat. The pattern Gerald had noticed wasn't subtle once you knew precisely where to look. Over roughly 26 months, small, incrementally increasing transfers, always structured just below the threshold that would typically trigger automatic bank review, had been quietly moving from Richard's personal investment accounts into Ashford Capital Holdings, an LLC formed just over 2 years earlier, with Trevor listed as its sole managing member. The total, once I finished tracing every transaction carefully, came to just over $340,000. I sat at my kitchen table for a long while after finishing that calculation, feeling something between professional clarity and a very personal, very painful betrayal settle over me at once. Of course, I said nothing to Trevor or Melissa yet. 25 years of federal investigative work teaches you, Above almost everything else, patience, and the importance of building a complete, defensible case before confronting anyone directly. I spent the following 2 weeks quietly gathering everything: bank records, LLC formation documents, transfer histories, cross-referencing dates against Trevor's own known financial pressures, a struggling boutique consulting business he'd launched 3 years earlier, mounting personal debts I discovered through entirely legal public record searches, the kind of desperate financial position that, in my professional experience, precedes exactly this type of family embezzlement scheme with striking regularity. Then came that Sunday dinner, the folder, the pen I set back down untouched, and Trevor's accusation that I had married his father for money, delivered by a man who had, by my careful calculation, already quietly redirected over $300,000 of that same father's money into an account he alone controlled. After I said what I said that night, the table sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Richard looked between his children and me, visibly confused, uncertain what exactly had just shifted in the room. "Diane," Melissa finally said, "what exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Melissa," I said. "I'm telling you that before your brother gets power of attorney over your father's finances, every single one of us in this room is going to sit down and review, in complete detail, exactly where your father's money has actually been going for the last 2 years." Trevor's face had gone noticeably pale. "This is completely unnecessary." "Then you won't mind the review," I said evenly. Richard looked at his son for a long moment. Something in his expression, despite the tremor, despite the occasional confusion, remained entirely sharp. "Trevor," he said quietly, "answer her." Trevor did not answer that night. He left shortly after, citing an early morning meeting, and Melissa followed soon after, considerably less confident than she'd arrived. 2 days later, I called Richard's estate attorney, a thorough, unflappable woman named Carol Reyes, and asked her to meet with both Richard and me directly. "Carol, I need to walk you through some financial records I've compiled," I said, once we were settled in her office, Richard beside me, quiet and attentive. "I used to do this professionally, for the Bureau. I'd like your legal opinion on what I'm seeing." I laid out everything I'd found. Carol reviewed it carefully, her expression growing increasingly serious as she worked through the documentation. "Diane," she said finally, "this is, frankly, a remarkably thorough forensic accounting workup. If what you're describing is accurate, and based on this documentation, it certainly appears to be, this constitutes financial elder abuse and likely outright embezzlement, regardless of any family relationship involved." Richard sat very still, absorbing that slowly. "Trevor did this," he said quietly. "Not quite a question." "I believe so," I said gently. "I'm sorry, Richard." "How long have you known?" he asked. 2 weeks, I admitted. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. "To you or anyone else?" Carol reviewed the power of attorney form Trevor had presented at dinner. "This document, if signed, would have given Trevor extraordinary control over your remaining accounts, Richard, at precisely the moment he appears to have already been quietly draining a significant portion of them. I'd strongly advise against signing anything of this nature going forward, without independent legal review." "I never signed it," Richard said. "Diane wouldn't let me." Carol looked at me with something like professional respect. "Good instinct." "Not instinct," I said. "Pattern recognition. I spent 25 years learning exactly what this particular pattern looks like. Now, when people imagine confrontation, they usually picture something loud, immediate, dramatic. In my professional experience, the most effective confrontations are almost always the opposite: quiet, methodical, built entirely on documentation too solid to argue with. A week after that meeting, I asked Trevor to come to the house alone, without Melissa, without his father present, just the two of us. He arrived defensive, arms crossed, before he'd even fully stepped through the door. "If this is about the accounts again, Diane, I really don't appreciate being ambushed." "Sit down, Trevor," I said calmly, gesturing toward the kitchen table where I'd laid out, in careful chronological order, every transfer, every statement, every formation document, connected to Ashford Capital Holdings. He sat, his confidence visibly faltering as he registered exactly what was spread across that table. 26 months, I said. $340,000, moved in careful increments, specifically structured to avoid automatic review flags. I know precisely how this works, Trevor, because catching exactly this kind of pattern was my entire professional career for 25 years. His face had gone completely pale. "I was going to pay it back," he said quietly. "Every dollar. The business just needed more time." "Your business is nearly $200,000 in debt," I said. I checked. "There was no version of this where you were paying anything back on the timeline you needed." He put his face in his hands. "Dad can't ever know." "Your father already knows," I said. I told him myself 2 weeks ago. Trevor's head snapped up. And he still let me come here today? He wanted to give you the chance to explain yourself directly, I said. To me, and eventually to him. That's more grace than most people in his position would offer. Trevor sat in silence for a long moment, something in his posture slowly collapsing under the weight of finally being seen clearly. I called you a gold digger at dinner, he finally said, in front of everyone. You did, I agreed. I was terrified, he admitted. Terrified you'd figure out what I'd done before I could fix it, and terrified of what would happen to me if you did. So I attacked first. That's a very old, very human instinct, I said. It's also exactly the kind of pattern I spent 25 years learning to see through. Over the following weeks, at Richard's insistence, Trevor voluntarily began repaying the misappropriated funds through a structured agreement Carol drafted, working with a financial counselor to restructure his failing business, and, more slowly, began the far harder work of rebuilding trust with a father he'd nearly betrayed completely. Melissa, once she understood the full extent of what her brother had actually done, came to me privately, considerably humbled. I owe you an apology, she said. A real one. I called you a gold digger at that table without ever once asking who you actually were before you married my father. I understand why, I said. Grief makes people protective in complicated ways. 25 years at the FBI, she said, shaking her head slightly. Dad mentioned it once, years ago, and I honestly don't think I ever fully registered it. I just filed you away as Dad's new wife, and never looked much closer. Most people don't, I said. It's not usually meant unkindly, it's just easier to see people as the smallest version of themselves that fits neatly into the story you've already decided about them. She nodded slowly. I'd like to actually get to know the rest of the story, if you're willing. I'd like that too, Melissa, I said, and meant it completely. About 4 months after that dinner, Richard and I hosted a much quieter Sunday meal. Just the four of us, Trevor and Melissa both present. The tension that had defined nearly every family gathering for years, finally, cautiously, beginning to ease. I keep thinking about that night, Trevor admitted, near the end of the meal. The way you just set that pen down, so calmly, like you already knew exactly what you were looking at. I did, I said. Recognizing a pattern before anyone else in the room sees it isn't really a dramatic skill, Trevor. Mostly it's just patience, and a willingness to look closely at things other people would rather not examine too carefully. I judged you the second you married Dad, he said. Decided who you were before I ever bothered finding out. You wouldn't be the first, I said. Or the last, probably. But I'd rather be underestimated by people who eventually take the time to look closer than overestimated by people who never do. Richard reached over and took my hand, his tremor steady beneath my fingers. I got remarkably lucky, he said quietly, marrying a woman patient enough to actually save this family from itself. If you've stayed with me this long, here is what I hope you take from my story. People are so often quick to decide who someone is based on the smallest, most convenient version of them. A stepmother, a widow, a quiet woman gardening on a Sunday afternoon. Real character, real capability, is almost always built somewhere far deeper than the surface anyone bothers examining. I think often about the 25 years I spent building a skill set almost nobody in my new family ever thought to ask about, and how easily that entire history nearly became invisible, simply because it didn't fit the story certain people had already decided to tell about me. There's a particular, quiet loneliness in being underestimated by the people closest to you. One I understood better than I ever admitted, even to myself, until the moment that underestimation nearly cost my husband everything. If someone in your life seems smaller or simpler than they probably are, consider that you likely don't yet know their whole story. And if you're ever tempted to judge someone by the smallest, most convenient version of who they appear to be, I hope you take the time to look closer, before the truth has to reveal itself the hard way. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, I would be honored if you shared it with them. And if you'd like more stories about family, quiet resilience, and the truth that always seems to find its way home eventually, stay close. There are more stories still to come. Thank you for spending this time with me.